Hello, and welcome to week 7 of Communicate Responsibly. I'm glad you're here, and if you have not checked out the previous weeks, I would encourage you to do that before you listen to week 7. We are going in order. We're going to do 52 weeks of talking about communicating responsibly. And this week, we're going to talk about the role of your ego and your pride in emotional intelligence and how that relates to communicating responsibly. So, for the last few weeks, we've been talking about increasing your self-awareness. What are the ways I communicate? How are people experiencing me? What are the things that I have strengths in? And what are the things that I want to work on? We also have introduced this word emotional intelligence. I'll get back to that in a minute. But this week, we're going to throw in those words pride and ego. So when I say those words, pride and ego, just think about what comes up for you. What does that mean for you? Is pride a positive thing to have? Is ego a positive thing to have? Um, yeah. What are your thoughts about pride and ego? Just kind of start bringing those up as we get into this. Now, just so you know, next week we're at week 8. We're going to wrap up this particular focus about self-awareness, emotional intelligence. We're going to wrap up the last 3 weeks when we've been digging into that. And I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned and tried to practice about what to do when you get triggered or when you're not hitting the mark in those places that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. And then the week after that, we're going to get into a whole different area of communicating responsibly. So, emotional intelligence. I've mentioned this over the past couple weeks, but just to go back, because for me, this was a new term. I hadn't heard of emotional intelligence, certainly growing up, or even in my studies to become a counselor and a teacher. It's something I was just exposed to in the last couple years. So I had to Google and search around. I'm trying to keep things as simple as I can. When you hear people talk about the term emotional intelligence, what they're saying is really your self-awareness. That's part of it. Your self-regulation. Are you one of these people who just kind of says, well, I have no filter and I just say it like I see it and I just go? Well, that would be a lower kind of self-regulation that you have in terms of emotional intelligence. Another thing that people, it's like a score that they have, is what is your awareness, your social awareness? How aware are you of the person or people around you? And again, this isn't good or bad. These are things that we're just taking an inventory of ourselves and seeing where our strengths and challenges are. So, how aware are you socially? And then the last part of emotional intelligence is your management of relationships. So when you look back in your life at the relationships you've had, and they're not just romantic relationships, sometimes people go there when that word relationship is out, your friendships, your family relationships, any relationship you've had, work, school, whatever it is, how do you feel that you've managed those? Are you someone who has friends and they've been friends since you were a kid and lifelong friends and you're very loyal? Are you someone who's just kind of walked away from relationships and formed new relationships? Are you someone who doesn't have a lot of relationships in your life? All things to think about. So, emotional intelligence, for cooking that up, the ingredients are your self-awareness, your self-regulation, your social awareness, and your management of relationships in your life. That's what emotional intelligence is. Okay, let's get back to the terms pride and ego. So, again, for me, when I grew up, being proud of myself or having someone be proud of me That was definitely something that I was reaching for, that I wanted to, especially my parents. I wanted them to be proud of me. Teachers, coaches, adults in general. You should be proud of yourself. And you wanted people to be proud of you. Ego, I didn't really think about or hear until I got into the counseling type thing. And ego, for me, again, just seemed to be the kind of thing that you wanted to watch out for, especially when I got into AA. So, through my filter, the 12-step program, and I've mentioned this before, AA, NA, Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, I have experienced it as a lot of ego deflation. I've heard people say in AA, alcoholics are egomaniacs with low self-esteem. And that made sense to me. Egomaniacs with low self-esteem. There was also a joke someone told me about an alcoholic who was out for their first date with someone. And for the first half an hour, this alcoholic is just talking about themselves. Well, I do this and I do that, and I've been captain of this and I work here. And then finally, after a half an hour, of course, they took a drink and said, but I'm kind of tired of talking about me and everything I've accomplished. What do you think about me? What do you like about me? Ego. So for me, that has been my experience of those words. Maybe it's not for you, but here are some things to think about. Scale of 1 to 10. One is I am not a very proud or ego-centered person. That's not me. 10 is, oh yeah, I'm very think I'm not much, but I'm all to think about. That's something else I've heard when it comes to pride and ego. Where are you on the scale? And regardless, here are some things to kind of think about that I hadn't. So pride isn't always loud. It's not always banging your own cymbal, ringing your own bell. And ego isn't always arrogance. It doesn't always have to be arrogance. Sometimes our ego can show up as being defensive in communication and relationship. Our ego can show up in needing to win the argument or be right. And we've talked about that over these last 7 weeks too, that needing to be right. That might relate to your ego. It also can be wanting someone to understand you, but not really being concerned with understanding them. That might go back to ego as well. And I've mentioned all four of these things, but another one is having a hard time apologizing or owning your part or taking an inventory, which is a lot of what I have asked, maybe challenged you to do in these past several weeks. Is take an inventory yourself. You are something you can control if you decide to. Your habits are something you can change if you decide to. That is only true for you. You can't make anybody else do that stuff. So think about ego defensiveness, needing to win or be right, really wanting people to understand you, but not emphasizing a curiosity in understanding them, and having a hard time apologizing or saying you're wrong. Emotional intelligence goes back to all of that. And a higher emotional intelligence would mean that you're able to manage these parts of pride and ego in a way that is effective in relationships and communication. So let's go back to the word pride. I grew up thinking, I want to be proud of myself, proud of others. Pride does not necessarily need to be a negative thing. I think of the saying, pride comes before the fall, right? That you don't want to be cocky, you don't want to be overconfident. But pride can be things like self-respect, just having self-respect. And that's good, right? It can also be having integrity. I have integrity, I have values, I have ethics. That's all part of pride. It can be a confidence that has roots, like the seven habits roots that I've talked about in past weeks, that your confidence is rooted in values that you have. And I think integrity would be a part of that. And pride is also just identifying and owning your strength, which can be very challenging. So owning your strengths and knowing how to use your strengths, all part of pride. Ego, when we get into where ego might be unhealthy, that's where we see that someone's identity, which is really what ego is about, identity, is fragile. And again, there's just no denying that we're in a place in America right now where we're seeing a lot of this, a kind of fragile identity or ego. There is not this confidence in values and ego, and there's not a confidence in the values or the integrity you have. There's not a self-respect that goes deeper than that. There's this fragile identity of needing other people to validate everything that you do. The need to be right and not being able to let it go or accept where other people are at. Interpreting when you disagree with somebody as rejection. And this can be some old stuff that we've talked about in the last 3 weeks. We disagree all the time, but there's many different ways to get things done, right? So if we interpret because of our own stuff disagreement as rejection, ego, that's ego. And if you personalize things, just neutral feedback, if you personalize it and take that on, that goes back to your ego too. So ego, its primary job, and this is not something I came up with. I found this in different definitions of ego. I thought this one was good, is protection of your identity. Ego wants to protect your identity. How have I established my identity? And when I feel those things coming up, needing to be right, I want other people to validate me. If you disagree with me, you're rejecting me. When you give me feedback, I see that as personalizing, it's going deeper. If you have a reaction to that, your ego is trying to protect this identity that you have created. Even if your parents had a part, your environment had a part, if you are an adult and living in this human kind of body at this point, owning that you have a part in that identity is really important because you can change it. So maybe you start to dig around and change those things and say, yeah, why am I having those reactions? Everyone has an ego. The question, if we get specific about communication and effective communication, is when does my ego get in the way of running this conversation? How is my ego affecting relationships at work, at school, with family members, with the person driving on the Northway, right? Not doing it my way or bringing up a reaction in me. And obviously in your romantic relationships, how does ego get in? And is ego starting to run that conversation? So let's go a little bit deeper. Here are some communication patterns that you may hear if your ego is coming up. Now I'm communicating verbally with someone. Defensiveness. Do you know what you sound like when you get defensive? A defensive line may be where you interrupt somebody and say, that's not what I meant. You've got that wrong, right? Or even stronger defensiveness is where you tell the other person, you're overreacting, right? I've got those you things in there. That's not what I meant, is not, oh, let me try to explain that in a different way. All of this, folks, is us taking responsibility and changing those things we can on our side rather than placing blame on the other person. So, how do you get defensive? Here's another one. I don't think I do this. I'm sure I did in the past when I was younger. The one-upsmanship. So someone is telling you something And you might not interrupt, but boy, you're just waiting for them to get done. And then you're going to tell them about a vacation you went on that was so much better. Or you're going to tell them about the wedding that your child had that was just a little bit, the food was better, location was better. If we take this in a different way, somebody's telling you something they went through and it was very difficult. And then you tell them something you went through because you feel it was more difficult. And I'm not saying you do these things on purpose. Maybe in your mind, you're saying, I'm just trying to identify with them. I'm trying to show them that I get where they're coming from, but you're not focusing on them. You're making it about you because of ego. That's the whole point, right? Um, Correcting someone instead of listening to them. That's a big one. And I see that in relationships sometimes where you're correcting the person rather than really just trying to draw out. And sometimes people will say, well, I didn't really understand what they meant. There are ways to correct people or get out the meaning without saying, no, you're wrong there. You don't like if we go back to the defensiveness, you're telling it wrong. That's not what I meant, right? So if you're going to correct somebody, coming up with language that doesn't sound like one-upsmanship, that you know more, you know better. Okay. Here's one I'm guilty of. That's why I saved it to the end, and I've mentioned it before. Stonewalling people or just withdrawing from them, using silence as some kind of power. That's a big one for me. And it's a horrible way of communicating because it's not communicating at all. But that can be from an egocentric place. And I know for me, yes, it's ego. And oftentimes, if I do withdraw from someone, I kind of get, I call it an emotional hangover since I haven't had an actual hangover in almost 3 decades. I don't feel good about it, right? And yet, the longer I go without talking to them or stonewalling them, the more likely I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to make it right. So for me, it's real important to say something sooner rather than later when I get into that conflict. And next week, we'll talk in more depth about that when we get into what you can do when you're triggered, difficult conversations. So, stonewalling people, using silence as power, emotionally shutting down with them, yeah, that's all ego as well. Last 3 weeks, probably beyond, I have talked about your nervous system, old brain, new brain, and how our nervous system and brains are responsible for this. Still, we can change it habitually, but when your ego, your identity feels threatened, it's going to go back to those old instinctual patterns you have that you've been doing over and over and over again. So, in a way, you go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn in the way that you react to situations. And that is ego too. What? Maybe I'm the only one that's surprised by that. But for me, really remembering that these terms go back to ego is important. So I get triggered, my ego reacts, my emotions start to escalate, and then the communication just goes off the rails. It's not effective anymore. And for me, a lot of that is shutting down. That's just for me. Maybe for you, it's yelling. Maybe for you, it's going back into something that you know isn't working either. We can change those things. So, what do we want to do? These are all repetitive things I've mentioned too, but they're going to work toward your ego. Slow down. Slow down in your responses. Pause before you respond. Label the emotion you're feeling. If we want to understand the emotion the other person's feeling, we can ask questions about that. But first, we got to own our own. Make sure you don't mistake your feelings for facts. I've gotten a lot of things wrong about the way I thought people felt about me or the way I have a reaction to certain things. That's a feeling. It's not necessarily a fact. And a key one, an absolutely key one, comes to staying curious. To me, that's the same as staying open to learning about the other person. But having a true curiosity is really important. So, here's a few tips, and then we'll get to more next week. If you feel like, oh my gosh, I just heard that about the ego and pride, and it's happening right now in this conversation or in this situation that I'm in, ask yourself, what part of my identity am I trying to protect right now? Am I trying to just be right? Am I trying at all to understand the other person's point of view? And even if you're not, at least ask yourself the question, what's going on here in me? Because me, I can control. And then a little bit deeper, if you ask yourself, what am I protecting? Am I trying to be right? Am I trying to understand them? Is this a truth about my identity? Right? Somebody calls me ugly. Somebody calls me unintelligent. Somebody calls me, I don't know, a hog or a racist or a whatever they call me, and I have a reaction to that. So, am I trying to protect something right now? Am I trying to make them understand I'm really not like that? Or is there some kind of inherent truth in what they're saying, something I believe about myself or my identity that might be there? You're full of yourself. You don't think of anyone but yourself. You know, those things. These are the deeper levels for you to look at. Here comes our key word, and we're on the downside now, humility. How do we start to counteract pride and ego if it's getting in the way and it's not very effective? Let's start defining humility. Here's what it's not. It's not self-deprecation, right? It's not thinking less of yourself. It might be thinking of yourself less. It's not weakness, and it's not being passive, humility. What it is accurate self-assessment, accurate inventory of yourself. A person who has increased emotional intelligence and kind of knows who they are with all the warts and everything, that's a humble person. A humble person is open to learning, open to being influenced, and not in a bad way, right? We still know, well, I'll listen. I'll listen to what you got to say. I'm not stuck in my ways. And also, a humble person has a willingness to repair relationships because they value the relationship above their own ego and whatever that ego kind of has to do with it. And I got work to do here. My ego definitely gets in the way, right? So the power of saying to someone, you might be right. You might be right, right? See how that feels in conversations, especially a person that you may have this with. It will lower defensiveness, not just in the other person, but probably in yourself. Here's another one for curiosity. Tell me more about that. It's an open-ended question. It's a reflection, really. And it asks the person to give you maybe better understanding. Even if everything is in you and inside of you says, I don't agree, I don't know, tell me more about that. Here's a few more. Try to apologize quickly. More on that next week. Ask some clarifying questions with your tell me more. Admit uncertainty. You don't have to say, yeah, you're right, just to end the conversation. As a people pleaser, I've done that before. Oh, yeah, okay. And then I walk out and go, "Psh." No. But admit that you're uncertain. I'm listening. I'm not sure. Not sure. So being honest and authentic. And here's a really good one. Try to thank people for talking to you, especially if they gave you feedback that was difficult. Thank you for telling me that. I'm uncertain. I'm feeling this way about it, but I appreciate that you trust me enough in this relationship to tell me what you told me. Notice in yourself how you're feeling. Does your chest get tight? Is there an urge to interrupt? I'm getting defensive. Am I rehearsing conversations in my head before I get there? I know I'm guilty of that more in the past, but I still do it. If it's a fear you have, what are you afraid of? That you'll look incompetent? That they won't like you? That you don't get their validation or approval? Are you afraid you're being dismissed? Or here's a big one. How about just losing control? If I let them do this, I'm not going to be in control of it anymore. That's pretty powerful, right? Curiosity is where it's at. In all relationships, even if you think you really know somebody, I know my wife and I, we met in 1990. I still find things out about her if I stay curious, right? And you can get curious by saying things like, can you help me understand? Right? Help me understand. And maybe, again, this one, I saw this suggested a lot, so I'm going to put it out there. Asking someone, what did you hear me say? That, depending on your relationship and the person, I might say, can you tell me what you're taking away from this? You know, but just getting there so the communication is tighter, so there is a continuity in what you're saying, and you know they're understanding. Respond, try not to react. I've said this before. Being slow is going to beat being fast, especially if you're that person who has no filter, and this is just who I am. Try not to yell at people, lower your volume. Try to say more with less words. I've talked before about my father used to describe people as taking a long time to tell a short story. And I still run into these people. They are verbose, right? Um, but shorten your sentences. Can you say more with less? I love writing. It's something that I just get a natural high out of. It's one of my creative outlets. And it's always challenging to say as much as you can with fewer words. The editing has really been the biggest part I find with writing and with talking too, right? Can I say it with less? So emotionally intelligent language, responsible communication is slower communication, and it usually is done concisely. All right. A lot to think about for the next week. I hope that you will take some tips from this. Maybe you have someone you want to add or someone that you want to ask about yours. Certainly do that. Here's a few more questions, and then you got a lot to chew on. Maybe you want to listen to this one again. Because remember, next week we're going to wrap this all up. We're going to change to a different subject in responsible communication. So, over the next week, where does your ego show up the most? Is it at work? Is it at home? Is it when you're in NASCAR driving down the freeway? Where does your ego show up the most? Who do you think feels safest disagreeing with you, pulling you up, giving you feedback, constructive feedback? And when was the last time that you apologized to someone without explaining yourself? Just, I'm sorry, period. But I was in a really bad place, but I had this going on. As soon as you put the but, it takes some power. I'm sorry. I was wrong. And that's it. You can be confident, right, in yourself without being rigid. You can have convictions without getting defensive, and you can protect your own dignity and values and ego, sense of self, without attacking someone else's. I'm not saying this like I got it all down. These are all things I'm going to work on this week too. So with that, I think we'll close it up, which is good because my dog Mickey's just waking up, and I'm sure she's going to want to bark at the birds. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you being here. And let me know your thoughts if you want more. If you got stuff to add, let me know. You can email me or you can check out my website, firststepconsultation.com. Eventually, I want to get out on the road and talk to some workplaces, schools, whoever, about all this responsible communication because we need it. We can change the world. We can change the irresponsible and ineffective communication going on right now just by making changes to ourselves. I believe that, and I know you can do it. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you next week. Bye.